If nearly all the men on Earth once disappeared, then human history has forgotten its most profound rupture. There is no legend that speaks of it, no monument marks it, no shared memory warns that it ever occurred. And yet, something did. The first clue did not emerge from ancient texts or buried ruins. It appeared quietly, through modern genetics, when scientists began mapping human ancestry at a molecular level. As large populations were compared, researchers expected to see roughly parallel histories between male and female genetic lines. What they found instead was a disturbing imbalance. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited through mothers, tells a story of continuity. Female lineages branch widely, surviving migrations, climate shifts, and long periods of instability. The record is broad, resilient, and diverse. The Y chromosome tells a different story. Passed only from father to son, the Y chromosome should preserve a comparable diversity. Under normal conditions, population declines affect both sexes similarly. But when researchers examined Y chromosome variation, they found an extreme narrowing, so severe that entire male lineages appeared to vanish from the record. At first, this anomaly was dismissed. Early datasets were small. Statistical noise was suspected. But as sequencing technology improved and sample sizes expanded across continents, the pattern remained. Independent studies using different methods and drawn from populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia all pointed to the same conclusion. At some point, deep in prehistory, the number of reproducing men collapsed dramatically. Not gradually, not locally, but across much of the human population. Some population models suggest that during this period, fewer than one man reproduced for every 17 women. In genetic terms, this implies that up to 97% of male lines ceased to continue. These men may have lived, hunted, and aged, but their bloodlines ended. Their genetic signatures disappeared. This presents an immediate and unsettling problem. Natural catastrophes do not behave this way. Climate collapse, famine, pandemics, and volcanic events reduce populations indiscriminately. They leave traces in ice cores, sediment layers, and fossil records. Yet no known global environmental disaster aligns cleanly with the timing suggested by the genetic bottleneck. If disease were responsible, it would not have spared women so consistently. If famine were the cause, female lineages would show similar collapse. If an extinction-level event occurred, the geological record would testify. But it does not. The genetic evidence instead suggests selectivity. Women endured in large numbers. Men did not, at least not genetically. This distinction forces researchers to consider explanations beyond nature, into the realm of human behavior. Some scholars emphasize caution. Extinction may be misleading. What vanished were not necessarily bodies, but lineages. Reproduction became concentrated among a small number of men, while the majority left no descendants. Inheritance, not survival, is what the DNA records. Even so, the implications remain severe. Such extreme concentration of reproduction is rare in small-scale, egalitarian societies. It tends to emerge under conditions of prolonged inequality, rigid hierarchy, or sustained conflict, forces capable of reshaping populations over generations. And yet, when archaeologists examine material remains from this distant era, they find no empires, no cities, no centralized states enforcing power on a global scale. They find scattered settlements, stone tools, modest burials, evidence that appears almost incompatible with the scale of genetic collapse. A contradiction begins to surface. The DNA implies a demographic crisis of immense magnitude. The archaeological record offers little to explain it. Some researchers propose long cycles of intergroup violence, where rival male populations were repeatedly eliminated. Others suggest social systems in which victorious lineages absorbed women while excluding or killing competing men. Still others argue for non-lethal mechanisms: exile, ritualized killing, or enforced reproductive exclusion sustained over centuries. None of these explanations can yet be proven. All remain debated. But the genetic bottleneck itself is no longer in doubt. A world once existed in which most men did not pass on their genes, a world shaped by forces we struggle to see clearly. And if this collapse was not caused by accident or environment, then it leads to a darker question, one that genetics alone cannot answer. Not what happened, but what kind of human behavior could produce such silence? Because beyond the DNA lies the mechanism, and that mechanism was not natural. If the genetic collapse of male lineages did occur, then its greatest anomaly is not the scale of loss, but the absence of memory. Human societies remember trauma. Even fragmented cultures preserve echoes of catastrophe: flood myths, fire legends, ancestral warnings encoded in ritual. Yet no universal story speaks of a time when nearly all men vanished. There is no shared narrative of collapse passed down through generations. Only silence. This absence has unsettled researchers as much as the data itself, because the genetic signal is not subtle. It is sharp, concentrated, and persistent. Statistical models can adjust assumptions, refine timelines, and debate severity, but they cannot erase the underlying imbalance. The Y chromosome passed through a bottleneck so narrow that it fundamentally reshaped the human family tree. One explanation offered is that the event unfolded too slowly to be remembered as a single catastrophe. Not a sudden war or massacre, but a prolonged process stretching across centuries. In such a scenario, no generation would perceive itself as living through extinction. Each would only see fewer men, fewer rival lineages, fewer competing fathers. Over time, disappearance would feel normal. But this raises another problem. Processes that unfold slowly still leave material traces. Prolonged conflict produces defensive structures, trauma patterns on skeletons, shifts in settlement layouts. Hierarchical systems leave signs of inequality, elite burials, controlled resources, differential nutrition. Yet evidence for such widespread, sustained male-specific suppression remains elusive. Some archaeologists argue that we are misreading the record, that prehistoric violence did not resemble later warfare. There were no armies, no banners, no fortified capitals. Conflict may have been intimate, repetitive, and localized: ambushes, raids, executions carried out beyond the settlements themselves. Such acts would leave few traces and fewer survivors to remember them. Others suggest that killing may not have been the primary mechanism at all. In many traditional societies, men who lose status lose access to reproduction. They are exiled, subordinated, or absorbed into groups where they cannot pass on their lineage. Over generations, this alone can erase genetic lines without mass death. In this view, the bottleneck reflects not slaughter, but exclusion. Yet even exclusion demands enforcement. It requires rules, norms, and consequences severe enough to hold across generations. It implies systems of control powerful enough to reshape humanity's genetic future, long before writing, law codes, or formal states. This leads to one of the most uncomfortable contradictions of all. The societies capable of producing such an outcome appear, archaeologically, to be small and simple. But the outcome itself is anything but simple. It suggests coordination, persistence, and an underlying logic that transcended individual groups. Some researchers have proposed that this was not a single global event, but many similar events unfolding independently. Different regions, different groups, all converging on comparable social structures that favored a small number of dominant male lines. Over time, these parallel processes could produce a global genetic pattern without a single cause. If so, the implication is disturbing. It would mean that under certain conditions, human societies repeatedly arrive at the same solution: extreme concentration of male power and the quiet elimination of alternatives. Not because they communicate, but because the structure itself is stable, self-reinforcing. And if that structure emerged once, it could emerge again. Still, caution remains essential. Genetics reveals outcomes, not intentions. It tells us who reproduced, not who ruled, who suffered or who resisted. It cannot distinguish between coercion and consent, between survival strategy and brutality. Every interpretation risks projecting modern assumptions onto a world fundamentally unlike our own. What remains undeniable is the scale of transformation. After this bottleneck, human populations expand again. Male lineages diversify. Social systems stabilize into forms that eventually lead toward agriculture, settlement, and recorded history. Whatever occurred before that stabilization did not persist unchanged, but stabilization does not mean resolution. The genetic record preserves the scar, not the story. It tells us that something profound happened, then moved on, and in doing so it erased its own tracks, leaving behind a humanity shaped by an event it no longer remembers. This is where the evidence ends and the unease begins. Because if nearly all men once disappeared without a trace, then the forces capable of causing that disappearance did not need to announce themselves. They did not need monuments. They did not need memory. They only needed time. And whatever those forces were, they did not vanish with prehistory. If the genetic record preserves a collapse of staggering magnitude, then archaeology should bear its weight. It does not. This absence has become one of the most troubling aspects of the mystery. Archaeology is built to detect disruption. When populations decline sharply, landscapes change, settlements are abandoned, tool traditions shift. Burials multiply or disappear. Violence leaves marks on bone. Catastrophe announces itself in layers of earth. Yet when researchers examine the period suggested by the Y chromosome bottleneck, they do not find a clear horizon of destruction. There is no universal burn layer stretching across continents, no synchronized abandonment of regions, no mass graves that correspond to a loss of male life on a global scale. Instead, the archaeological record appears fragmented, uneven, and, at first glance, unremarkable. This creates a profound contradiction. Genetics suggests a demographic event powerful enough to reshape humanity itself. Archaeology, the discipline tasked with reconstructing lived reality, seems to register little more than continuity. Some scholars argue that this mismatch is an illusion caused by scale. Archaeology operates locally. Excavations reveal what happened in one valley, one river basin, one cluster of settlements. Genetics, by contrast, compresses thousands of years into a single statistical signal. A slow, distributed process could devastate male lineages without ever producing a single moment dramatic enough to fossilize in the ground. In this view, there was no day of collapse, only an accumulation of loss. Small conflicts repeated endlessly, raids that targeted men, cycles of retaliation that never escalated into formal war but never stopped either. Over generations, the toll would be enormous, even if no single site ever recorded it fully. But this explanation raises its own problems. Sustained violence leaves patterns. Skeletal remains from later periods show clear signs of trauma, fractures, embedded weapons, defensive wounds. If male-directed killing occurred on such a scale, similar signatures should appear consistently. Yet evidence for widespread systematic male trauma during this period remains sparse and inconsistent. In many regions, human remains are simply too few to tell a definitive story. Organic material decays. Burial practices vary. Some populations did not inter their dead in ways that preserve bones. Absence of evidence, archaeologists caution, is not evidence of absence. Still, the silence remains difficult to ignore. Another possibility is that archaeology is looking for the wrong kind of evidence. Modern assumptions about conflict are shaped by later societies, armies, fortifications, weapons designed solely for killing humans. But prehistoric conflict may have been embedded within daily life. Hunting tools double as weapons. Disputes are settled face to face. Killings occur far from settlements, bodies left exposed or disposed of in ways that leave little trace. In such a world, violence could be frequent yet archaeologically invisible. There is also the question of who controls the narrative of material culture. Archaeology often privileges what is built, owned, and accumulated. But the loss of male lineages may have involved dispossession rather than destruction. Men stripped of status, expelled from groups, denied access to mates, or absorbed into dominant lineages without reproductive rights would vanish genetically while leaving behind their tools, dwellings, and even their bones, indistinguishable from those who succeeded. In that case, the archaeological record would look deceptively stable. Some researchers point to subtle shifts instead, changes in settlement size, increased clustering in defensible locations, alterations in burial ratios where adult male graves become rarer or less elaborate. These signals exist in some regions, but they are inconsistent and often debated. Each could have multiple explanations unrelated to large-scale violence. The problem is not that archaeology contradicts genetics. It is that archaeology refuses to confirm it. This refusal has led to growing discomfort within the field. Because if a demographic transformation of this scale can occur without leaving an obvious material signature, then the limits of archaeological interpretation are far narrower than once believed. It would mean that entire chapters of human history, chapters written in bloodlines rather than stone, can pass almost unnoticed. And that realization carries an unsettling implication. If the ground does not remember what happened, then whatever erased those men did not rely on spectacle. It did not need cities to burn or monuments to fall. It worked quietly, persistently, within the structure of human interaction itself. And if archaeology cannot easily see it, then understanding this collapse will require looking elsewhere, not at what ancient people built, but at how they organized power. That search leads away from artifacts and towards social systems still only dimly understood. If archaeology cannot clearly see the collapse, then perhaps collapse is the wrong lens. What if nothing visibly fell apart? This question has begun to reshape how some researchers approach the problem. Rather than searching for signs of destruction, they ask whether the societies of this period may have remained outwardly intact while undergoing an internal transformation so severe that it erased most male genetic lines without dismantling daily life. In this view, power did not arrive with walls, crowns, or centralized states. It existed in social rules. Who could marry? Who could stay? Who could reproduce? And who could be removed without consequence? Such systems do not require monuments. They require compliance. Anthropological studies of later, small-scale societies offer unsettling parallels. In some documented cases, a narrow group of dominant males controls access to women across multiple generations. Rivals are killed, expelled, or absorbed as non-reproducing subordinates. The group continues to hunt, gather, trade, and migrate. From the outside, it appears stable. Genetically, it is anything but. If similar structures emerged repeatedly in prehistory, they could explain the paradox. Male lineages would vanish rapidly, yet settlements would persist. Tools would continue to be made. Children would still be born. Only the invisible ledger of inheritance would record the loss. This possibility reframes the archaeological silence not as failure but as misdirection. Power, in this context, leaves few durable traces. It is enforced through threat, tradition, and shared belief. When successful, it minimizes resistance, and resistance is what most often leaves marks. A man expelled from his group may die alone, far from any site likely to be excavated. A man denied reproduction may live and work among others, leaving behind bones indistinguishable from those whose genes continued. Such outcomes would be archaeologically invisible. There is also the issue of time. The genetic bottleneck does not require a single dramatic episode. A few centuries of skewed reproduction could be enough. Spread across generations, this would dilute any clear signal. No layer of ash, no field of bones, just a gradual narrowing, recorded only in what survives to the present. Critics argue that this explanation risks unfalsifiability. If evidence is absent because the process leaves no trace, how can it ever be tested? This concern has merit. Archaeology depends on material proof. Yet genetics has already demonstrated that something extraordinary occurred, regardless of whether the ground remembers it. This tension has led some scholars to reconsider the relationship between violence and visibility. The most effective forms of domination may be those that appear least violent. Systems that normalize exclusion, that turn inequality into tradition, can reshape populations more thoroughly than open warfare. If so, then the prehistoric collapse of male lineages may not represent a failure of society, but a grim form of success. A stable arrangement, maintained long enough to remake humanity's genetic landscape. That idea carries troubling implications. It suggests that early human groups were capable of sustaining extreme inequality without complex institutions, that small, mobile societies could enforce rules severe enough to determine who would exist thousands of years later, and that such systems did not require universal agreement, only enough compliance to persist. Archaeology, focused on objects and places, struggles to capture this kind of power. It records what people left behind, not what they were forbidden to do. It sees what was built, not what was denied. And so the silence remains, not because nothing happened, but because what happened may have been designed to leave no trace. If that is true, then the collapse recorded in DNA was not an accident nor a catastrophe imposed from outside. It was a human solution to human competition, applied again and again until only a few lines remained. But this interpretation raises a final unresolved problem. If such systems were once widespread enough to erase most male lineages, why did they not last? Why did humanity eventually move away from arrangements that concentrated reproduction so narrowly? Something changed, and whatever disrupted that ancient balance of power did leave traces, not in bones or ruins, but in the reorganization of society itself. To understand what followed the silence, we must look not at what disappeared, but at what replaced it. If power once operated without monuments, then it must have moved through something far more ancient and intimate than states or armies. It moved through kinship. Long before borders or banners, human survival depended on small groups bound by blood, marriage, and obligation. These groups, bands, clans, early tribes, were not merely social units, they were systems of protection, identity, and reproduction. To belong was to survive. To be excluded was to vanish. Anthropologists have long noted that in such societies, conflict rarely resembles later warfare. There are no standing armies, no prolonged campaigns. Instead, violence is episodic, personal, and often asymmetrical. Raids occur at dawn. Ambushes target individuals rather than formations. Retaliation is selective, not total. In this context, men are both the primary agents and the primary targets of violence. Ethnographic records from historically documented small-scale societies show a recurring pattern. Intergroup conflict disproportionately removes adult males. Women and children are often captured or absorbed. Men, especially those capable of retaliation, are killed. Over time, this produces a skewed demographic outcome, one that echoes the imbalance seen in the genetic record. Some researchers suggest that prehistoric conflict may have operated in this manner for centuries, not as a single global war, but as countless local hostilities, all governed by similar social logic. Each conflict small, each loss seemingly contained. Yet across generations, the cumulative effect would be devastating. In such a world, a tribe itself becomes a weapon, not through conquest of land, but through control of lineage. Victorious groups absorb women from defeated rivals, increasing their reproductive reach. Defeated men are eliminated or excluded, their genetic lines ending quietly. The tribe grows not by territory, but by inheritance. This mechanism does not require centralized leadership. It requires only persistent rivalry and a shared understanding of who belongs and who does not. Kinship becomes both shield and blade. But here too contradictions emerge. If intertribal violence drove the collapse of male lineages, then conflict must have been extraordinarily widespread and sustained. It would need to occur across diverse environments, among groups with different cultures and technologies, yet produce a remarkably similar outcome. This implies not coordination, but convergence, a repeated return to the same destructive pattern. Why would human societies independently adopt such extreme strategies? One possibility lies in competition itself. In environments where resources are limited and groups are small, eliminating rival males while capturing their women may offer a short-term advantage. It reduces future threats while increasing reproductive capacity. Over time, groups that practice this strategy may outcompete those that do not. Yet this logic carries risk. Excessive violence destabilizes populations. It invites retaliation. It can fracture alliances and erode cooperation. Most human societies develop norms to limit internal bloodshed for precisely this reason. So why would restraint fail so broadly? Some scholars argue that the period in question may have been marked by heightened instability, climatic fluctuations, shifting migration routes, or sudden population pressure. Under such conditions, old norms break down. Survival strategies harden. What was once unthinkable becomes necessary. Still, the archaeological record offers only partial support. Evidence for widespread fortification or defensive settlement during this era is limited. Many sites suggest mobility rather than entrenchment. This implies that conflict, if present, did not always center on territory. It may have centered on people. If rival males were the primary obstacle to survival and reproduction, then targeting them directly would be more efficient than seizing land. The battlefield would not be a place, but a relationship, an ongoing struggle between lineages. This reframing alters how the genetic bottleneck is understood. It is no longer the result of a single forgotten war, but of a world in which conflict was normalized, inherited, and rarely resolved. A world where being born into the wrong lineage was itself a death sentence for one's genetic future. Yet even this explanation remains incomplete, because violence alone does not explain the precision of the collapse. Killing reduces populations. It does not automatically concentrate reproduction so narrowly. For that, something more is required. Rules about who may reproduce and who may not. Conflict may have opened the door, but something else decided who passed through it. And to find that mechanism, the focus must shift again, away from battle and toward the structure of early human society itself. If conflict opened the door to extinction, then rules determined who was allowed to survive. Violence alone is blunt. It kills indiscriminately, often unpredictably. But the genetic bottleneck recorded in the Y chromosome is not chaotic. It is precise. It suggests not just loss, but selection, an enduring pattern that favored a narrow set of male lines again and again. For this to occur, killing could not be the only mechanism. It had to be accompanied by social rules powerful enough to outlast individual conflicts. Anthropologists studying kin-based societies have long observed that reproduction is rarely a private matter. Marriage, mating, and inheritance are regulated by custom. Who may take a wife? How many? From which group and under what conditions? These decisions are embedded in social structure. They determine not only family life, but the future composition of the group. In some systems, high-status males monopolize reproduction. Polygyny concentrates offspring among a few men, while others are excluded entirely. Over generations, this alone can erase genetic lines without widespread death. Combine this with periodic violence that removes rivals and the effect intensifies dramatically. Some researchers suggest that prehistoric societies may have oscillated between conflict and consolidation. After periods of violence, surviving groups reorganized. Dominant lineages established rules that limited reproduction to insiders. Outsiders, especially men, were absorbed as labor, expelled, or killed if they threatened the balance. These rules did not need to be written. They were enforced through tradition, fear, and collective memory. A man who violated them risked not just punishment, but erasure from the future. This perspective reframes the bottleneck as a social technology, not a single invention, but a recurring pattern, one that could emerge wherever groups competed intensely and resources were uncertain. Over time, societies that concentrated reproduction may have expanded more effectively, their descendants spreading while others faded genetically. But this raises a troubling implication. If such systems were adaptive, even temporarily, then the collapse of male lineages was not an aberration. It was a consequence of strategies that worked, at least for those who benefited from them. The suffering of excluded men would leave no genetic trace, no lineage to remember them. And memory matters. Human history is written by descendants. Those who leave no offspring leave no stories. If most men did not reproduce, then most male experiences vanished with them. What survives is the perspective of the few who did. This may help explain the silence that follows. Why no myth warns of a time when men were systematically removed? Why no tradition mourns them? Their voices did not reach the future. Yet even this explanation encounters resistance. Such rigid reproductive control requires stability. It requires that rules be enforced across generations without collapsing into chaos. But the prehistoric world was mobile, fragmented, and often unstable. How could such systems persist long enough and broadly enough to reshape humanity itself? Some scholars argue that the answer lies not in uniformity but repetition, the same pattern emerging independently again and again wherever conditions allowed. Each instance local, each outcome similar. Over thousands of years, the global genetic signal would accumulate. If so, then there was no single forgotten war. There were countless small ones, countless exclusions, countless men whose lives ended without descendants. Together, they formed something far larger than any one conflict, a slow, grinding process that favored dominance over diversity. But this leads to an even deeper question. If early human societies were capable of such extreme concentration of power, why did it not define the rest of history? Why did humanity eventually move toward systems that, while still unequal, allowed male lineages to diversify again? The genetic record shows recovery. After the bottleneck, male diversity increases. New lines appear. The grip loosens. Something disrupted the pattern. Something altered the balance between violence, rule, and reproduction. And whatever that change was, it did not come from conquest or collapse, but from a transformation in how humans organized themselves. To understand that turning point, the search must move forward to the moment when exclusion gave way to expansion and the silent war began to lose its hold. If the collapse of male lineages was sustained by rules as much as violence, then it represents a form of conflict unlike anything later history would celebrate. There were no heroes in this war, no victories carved into stone, no songs composed to remember the fallen. What unfolded, if the evidence is read carefully, was not a clash of armies, but a long erosion of possibility. A war measured not in battles won, but in futures denied. In traditional warfare, even defeat leaves traces. Survivors remember, victors record. Landscapes change. But this prehistoric struggle appears to have been structured to erase itself. It removed men not only from life, but from lineage, and without descendants, remembrance becomes impossible. Some researchers describe this as a silent war, not because it lacked violence, but because it lacked narrative. Each act, each killing, each exclusion, each enforced loss of status was small enough to seem ordinary within its own time. No single generation would have recognized it as a catastrophe. Yet over centuries, the outcome was devastating. This reframes the idea of war itself. Rather than opposing sides meeting in open conflict, the struggle may have been continuous and internal to social life. Every dispute over mating rights, every challenge to authority, every expulsion of a rival male reinforced the same underlying structure. The battlefield was not a place. It was the social order. In such a system, dominance did not need to be absolute. It only needed to persist slightly longer than resistance. A lineage that controlled reproduction for a few generations would expand exponentially. A lineage denied access would disappear just as quickly. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Success breeds demographic power. Demographic power reinforces success. Over time, inequality hardens into inevitability. Yet the most unsettling aspect of this process is how ordinary it may have felt. From within these societies, there may have been no sense of living through extinction. Children were still born. Groups still moved across landscapes. Seasons still passed. The loss was statistical, not experiential. Only when viewed from tens of thousands of years later does the pattern become visible. This may explain why no moral reckoning survives. Later wars are remembered because they end. They produce ruins and transitions. This one did not. It simply faded, replaced by new arrangements before anyone could name what had been lost. Some scholars caution against calling this a war at all. They argue that the term risks projecting modern concepts backward. What occurred may have been closer to a chronic condition, an environment of constant low-level threat in which male survival was precarious and reproduction tightly guarded. But whether called war or system, the effect was the same. Most men did not become ancestors. This realization forces a reconsideration of prehistoric masculinity. Rather than a world dominated by equal male hunters and warriors, the genetic evidence suggests a hierarchy far steeper than once imagined. A few men fathered generations. Many others existed only briefly in the human story. and this hierarchy did not require centralized authority. It was enforced locally, repeatedly through shared expectations. Men learned early where they stood. Challenges were met with swift consequence. Compliance was safer than defiance. Such arrangements are efficient. They minimize internal instability. They reduce uncertainty over inheritance. But they do so at immense human cost, one that remains invisible without genetics to reveal it. Still, a crucial question remains unresolved. If this system was so effective, why did it not continue indefinitely? Why did it not carry forward unchanged into later human history? The answer cannot lie solely in violence or dominance. Those forces did not disappear. Yet the genetic bottleneck did end. Male diversity returned. New lineages emerged. Something disrupted the silent war. Something introduced instability into a system that had proven brutally stable. And that disruption did not announce itself with destruction. It arrived quietly, altering the rules of survival and reshaping what it meant to belong. To find it, the search must move deeper, not into conflict, but into transformation. If this silent war endured for generations, then victory came at a price few societies could sustain forever. Extreme concentration of power is efficient but fragile. When reproduction is controlled by a narrow group of men, the system depends on their continued dominance, health, and legitimacy. Any disruption, a death, a failed alliance, an internal challenge, can destabilize everything. The very inequality that fuels expansion also creates vulnerability. Some researchers suggest that this fragility may explain why the pattern eventually broke. As dominant lineages expanded, groups grew larger. Larger groups brought new pressures: coordination, resource distribution, conflict management. What worked in small bands became increasingly difficult to enforce as numbers rose. Exclusion bred resentment. Resentment invited rebellion, and rebellion, even if suppressed, introduced uncertainty into reproductive control. There was also the biological cost. Extreme reproductive skew reduces genetic diversity. While advantageous in the short term, it increases susceptibility to disease and environmental change. A population dominated by closely related males may expand rapidly, but it lacks resilience. Over time, such groups risk collapse. Genetics hints at this tension. After the bottleneck, male lineages do not remain narrow. They diversify again. New branches appear, suggesting that reproductive access widened. The system that once excluded most men loosened its grip. What caused this shift remains unclear. Some scholars point to changes in subsistence. As humans began to rely more on stable food sources, cooperation became more valuable than dominance. Others suggest that increasing intergroup exchange, trade, marriage alliances, shared rituals, made rigid exclusion impractical. Maintaining peace required inclusion. There is also the possibility that women played a role that the record struggles to capture. In systems where men monopolize power, women are often treated as resources. But demographic reality gives them leverage. If dominant lineages faced shortages of women or instability in alliances, reproductive rules may have adapted in response. None of these explanations can be confirmed. The archaeological signals are subtle. The genetic recovery is gradual. There is no single moment of transition, only a slow rebalancing. What is striking is that this rebalancing does not erase the past. The bottleneck remains visible, etched permanently into the Y chromosome. It is a scar that never fully heals. Modern humanity still descends from a remarkably small number of male ancestors who passed through that narrow gate. This realization reframes success and failure in prehistory. The men who dominated reproduction became the fathers of the future. The men who lost were erased so completely that even their suffering left no echo. History, in this sense, is not a record of what happened, but of who remained. And that raises an uncomfortable truth. If this silent war produced the foundations of later human expansion, then modern societies are built, in part, on its outcome. The stability that followed may have been purchased through centuries of exclusion that no one remembers. Yet the end of the bottleneck suggests that such systems are not permanent. They solve one problem only to create others. Over time, the cost of extreme inequality outweighs its benefits. This cycle, concentration, expansion, collapse, rebalancing, may be as old as humanity itself. And if that is the case, then the Forgotten War was not an anomaly. It was an early expression of a pattern that continues to surface whenever power narrows too far and too many futures are denied. To understand whether this pattern truly ended or merely changed its form, the next step is to follow the survivors, to the societies that emerged after the silence and the new rules they built to prevent its return. If the genetic record preserves one truth with clarity, it is this: women endured. Across the same period in which male lineages collapsed, female genetic diversity remained comparatively stable. Mitochondrial DNA does not show a parallel bottleneck. Mothers continued to pass on their lines through daughters and sons alike, generation after generation, even as most male lines disappeared. This imbalance is not a minor detail. It is the central paradox. Any explanation for the collapse must account for why women survived at scale while men did not, genetically, socially, and reproductively. Nature alone struggles to produce such an outcome. Human behavior does not. In societies shaped by conflict and inequality, women are rarely eliminated wholesale. They are captured, exchanged, absorbed. Their reproductive value ensures their survival, even in the aftermath of violence. Men, particularly rival men, represent threat rather than continuity. Removing them stabilizes dominance. Some researchers suggest that this dynamic operated repeatedly in prehistory. When groups clashed, defeated men were killed or excluded, while women were incorporated into the victorious group. Over time, this would erase male lineages while preserving and even redistributing female ones. The genetic record is consistent with this model. It suggests not isolation but movement, women crossing between groups, men disappearing from the future. This reframes survival itself. To survive in genetic terms was not simply to live, it was to be incorporated into a lineage that continued. Women were portable in ways men were not. Their bodies carried continuity across social boundaries. Men were bound to their lineage, and when that lineage fell, so did their genetic future. But this explanation introduces a deeper discomfort. It implies that the collapse of male lines was not merely a byproduct of violence, but a structural outcome of how societies valued reproduction. Women were protected because they were necessary. Men were expendable because they were replaceable, except at the very top. This hierarchy would have shaped daily life in ways archaeology struggles to detect. Young men growing up with limited prospects, rivalry intensified by scarcity of reproductive opportunity, status tied not just to skill or age, but to proximity to dominant lineages. Such conditions are unstable. They generate pressure. Yet the genetic outcome suggests that pressure did not explode outward. It was contained, managed, and repeated. Some scholars caution that the picture may be incomplete. Female survival does not imply female power. Endurance does not equal agency. The genetic record cannot tell us whether women consented to these arrangements, resisted them, or navigated them strategically. It records only that they reproduced. And still the asymmetry remains. If nearly all men once vanished from the genetic future but women did not, then the prehistoric world was not merely violent. It was organized around reproduction as a resource. Control over women's fertility may have been the true battleground, with male survival determined by access to it. This perspective forces a reconsideration of prehistoric society itself, not as a loose collection of equal hunters, but as a landscape of constrained opportunity, where lineage outweighed individuality, and most men lived on borrowed time. Yet even this does not fully explain the scale of the collapse, because absorbing women from defeated groups can increase diversity as much as it reduces it. Over time, such systems should broaden genetic input, not narrow it so dramatically. Something more restrictive must have been at work, something that limited not only who survived, but who was allowed to become a father at all. And that suggests that survival alone was not enough. To pass through the bottleneck, a man needed more than life. He needed permission. Where that permission came from and how it was enforced leads deeper into the structure of power itself. If permission determined survival, then reproduction was not a consequence of power, it was power. The genetic bottleneck implies more than violence or imbalance. It suggests regulation. For male lineages to narrow so severely while female lines persisted, reproduction itself must have been constrained by rules that were enforced repeatedly and effectively. Not everyone who lived was allowed to become a father. Not everyone who was capable was permitted to continue. In this context, sex was not merely biological, it was political. Some researchers propose that early human societies developed mechanisms to control paternity long before they developed formal governance. Kinship rules defined belonging. Marriage determined legitimacy. Offspring inherited not only genes, but status. To father a child was to secure a place in the future. To be denied that role was to disappear. Such systems do not require centralized authority. They thrive in small groups where reputation travels faster than law and punishment is immediate. A man who violated norms risked expulsion or death. A man who challenged dominant lineage claims risked elimination. Over time, compliance became survival. Polygyny amplifies this effect. When a small number of high-status men take multiple partners, reproductive inequality increases dramatically. Even without overt violence, most men are excluded. Add periodic conflict that removes rivals, and the exclusion becomes permanent. This combination, monopolized reproduction reinforced by selective violence, offers one of the few mechanisms capable of producing the genetic pattern observed. It is slow, cumulative, and devastatingly efficient. Yet it also produces a profound silence. Men denied reproduction leave no descendants to remember them. Their experiences vanish with them. What survives is the worldview of those who succeeded. Over generations, this creates the illusion of normality. Inequality becomes tradition. Tradition becomes invisible. This may explain why no counter-narrative survives, why no myth condemns the system, why no memory mourns the excluded. History, as preserved, belongs to the victors, not because they wrote it, but because they reproduced. Women, meanwhile, occupy an ambiguous position. They survive genetically, but their survival is mediated through male-controlled structures. Their bodies become the medium through which power reproduces itself. Whether they resisted, adapted, or leveraged these systems cannot be read from DNA alone. The record is mute on agency. What it does show is continuity. Even as male lines vanish, children continue to be born. Societies do not collapse. Life goes on. The catastrophe is invisible to those living within it. This invisibility may be the most disturbing aspect of all, because it suggests that humanity once endured a transformation so profound that it reshaped the species without ever recognizing it as such. No moment of reckoning, no collective alarm, just a gradual narrowing of who mattered. Eventually, something shifts. The genetic record shows recovery. Male diversity increases. New lineages take hold. The permission to reproduce spreads more widely. Why this happened remains uncertain. Perhaps rigid systems became unsustainable. Perhaps expanding populations demanded cooperation over exclusion. Perhaps new social arrangements diluted old hierarchies. What is clear is that the bottleneck did not end because it was remembered. It ended because it no longer worked. And that raises a final, unsettling possibility. If reproductive control once shaped humanity so completely, and did so quietly, then it is not a relic of prehistory. It is a force that can reappear wherever power narrows and permission replaces participation. The forgotten war may not have been fought with weapons alone. It may have been fought in beds, in marriages, in decisions about who was allowed to leave a mark on the future. And if that is true, then its legacy is not buried in the past. It is carried forward, generation by generation, in ways we are only beginning to recognize. If reproduction was controlled, then violence alone was not enough. Violence can remove rivals, but it cannot govern a future. For the collapse of male lineages to persist across generations, something more stable than fear had to take hold. Something repeatable. Something that outlived individual conflicts and individual men. It required rules. Long before written law, human societies were regulated by custom, shared expectations enforced through collective action. These rules determined who belonged, who could remain, and who had the right to form families. They were not debated, they were inherited, and breaking them carried consequences severe enough to discourage challenge. In this light, the prehistoric bottleneck begins to resemble not a breakdown of order, but the imposition of one. Some anthropologists suggest that early human groups developed proto-legal systems centered on lineage protection. These systems prioritized stability over fairness. They reduced uncertainty by narrowing access to reproduction, ensuring that only approved lines continued. In times of pressure, such arrangements may have been seen not as cruelty, but as necessity. From within the system, exclusion could appear justified. A man without lineage protection was a liability. He threatened cohesion, challenged authority, and introduced uncertainty into inheritance. Removing him, through exile, ritual killing, or enforced celibacy, simplified the social equation. Over time, these practices hardened into norms. This kind of order leaves little archaeological trace. Laws written in behavior do not fossilize. Enforcement carried out by peers leaves no monuments. Yet its effects can be profound, reshaping populations as effectively as conquest. Genetics may be the only reason this system is visible at all. The bottleneck suggests not sporadic brutality, but consistency. The same outcomes repeated across time and space. That repetition implies shared logic, not coordination between groups, but convergence on similar solutions to similar problems. Still, a crucial contradiction remains. Rules require legitimacy. They must be accepted, or at least tolerated, by the majority. How could systems that excluded so many men avoid constant rebellion? How did they persist without collapsing into endless violence? Some researchers argue that exclusion was graduated, not absolute. Young men may have competed for status, with only a minority ever reaching full reproductive rights. Others may have been allowed temporary access, later revoked. The line between inclusion and exclusion may have been fluid, shifting with circumstance. In such a system, hope becomes a tool of control. Men strive for approval. They conform. They enforce the same rules on others, believing they may one day benefit. By the time they realize they will not, it is too late. Their lineage ends quietly, without confrontation. This interpretation casts the prehistoric world in a different light, not as chaotic, but as tightly regulated. Not lawless, but governed by norms so strict they reshaped humanity itself. And yet, law without flexibility is brittle. As populations grow and interactions multiply, rigid systems strain. New alliances form, outsiders arrive. Trade, migration, and shared rituals complicate old boundaries. The more interconnected groups become, the harder it is to enforce exclusion without provoking instability. If the bottleneck ended, then these rules must have weakened. Something diluted their authority. Something made rigid control impossible to maintain. To understand that turning point, the focus must shift again, away from the mechanisms of exclusion and toward the conditions that allowed inclusion to return. Because the end of the Silent War did not come through rebellion alone. It came through transformation. And that transformation began not with weapons, but with changing ways of living together. If law once came before weapons, then its decline did not arrive with sudden violence. It arrived with erosion. Rules that depend on unanimity weaken as societies expand. Customs enforced through shared belief fracture when belief is no longer shared by all. The very success of early human groups, growth, migration, survival, may have undermined the systems that once controlled them so completely. As populations increased, groups encountered one another more frequently. Exchange replaced isolation. Marriage alliances formed between lineages that were once rivals. Information traveled farther. Norms that had once been unquestioned were exposed to alternatives. In such conditions, exclusion becomes harder to justify. A man denied reproductive rights within one group might find acceptance in another. A lineage weakened by rigid control might lose members to more flexible neighbors. Over time, groups that allowed broader participation could outcompete those that did not through violence, but through cohesion. Some researchers suggest that this shift marks a critical transition in human social evolution. As mobility increased and networks widened, maintaining strict reproductive monopolies became impractical. Enforcement required constant surveillance. Punishment provoked retaliation. The cost of control began to outweigh its benefits. This does not mean inequality disappeared. It did not. But its form changed. Instead of absolute exclusion, societies moved toward graded hierarchy. More men gained limited reproductive access. Status still mattered, but lineage was no longer the sole gatekeeper. This gradual opening would explain the genetic recovery seen after the bottleneck, new male lines emerging, diversity increasing without returning to full equality. Importantly, this recovery is slow. The Y chromosome does not rebound overnight. The scar remains visible for tens of thousands of years. Even as new lineages appear, they branch from a narrow base. Modern humanity still carries the imprint of that earlier constraint. This suggests that the rules did not collapse everywhere at once. Different regions likely transitioned at different speeds. Some clung to rigid systems longer, others adapted earlier. The genetic record compresses these variations into a single curve, masking local complexity. Yet the overall direction is clear. Exclusion weakened. This raises a final contradiction. If rigid control of reproduction was once so effective, why did humans abandon it at all? Why trade a system that ensured dominance for one that allowed rivals to persist? The answer may lie in unpredictability. Extreme inequality produces stability only under stable conditions. When environments change, climates shift, resources move, neighbors arrive, adaptability becomes more valuable than control. Diversity, once a threat, becomes insurance. Groups that allowed more men to reproduce produced more variation. More variation meant greater resilience. Over time, such groups may have survived disruptions that more rigid societies could not. If so, then the end of the bottleneck was not moral progress. It was strategic adaptation. Human societies did not become fairer. They became more flexible. And flexibility in an uncertain world is power of a different kind. This reframing challenges comforting narratives about human cooperation. It suggests that inclusion emerged not from compassion, but from necessity, that the silent war ended not because it was wrong, but because it was inefficient under new conditions. Still, this transformation leaves one final question unresolved. If the bottleneck shaped humanity so profoundly, if it determined who would exist at all, why is it absent from cultural memory? Why did no story survive to warn later generations of the cost of rigid power? Perhaps because memory itself is inherited. Those who benefited from the system became ancestors. Those who suffered did not. And so the lesson was never passed on. What remains instead is a pattern, one that rises, stabilizes, and eventually breaks, only to reappear in altered form. To see whether this pattern truly faded or merely evolved, the next step is to follow humanity forward, into the societies that emerged after the bottleneck, and the new inequalities they quietly built upon its remains. If the silent war ended not with collapse, but with adaptation, then what followed was not a return to innocence. It was inheritance. The societies that emerged after the genetic bottleneck did not arise on empty ground. They were built upon populations already shaped by extreme narrowing. Communities descended from a small number of surviving male lines, carrying forward social habits forged under pressure. Even as reproductive access widened, the imprint of earlier control did not vanish. It was absorbed, normalized, and passed on. Genetically, this is visible. Male diversity increases, but from a constrained base. Socially, the implications are harder to trace, yet no less significant. Hierarchy did not disappear with the bottleneck. It transformed. Where once exclusion had been absolute, it became structured. Where once permission was rare, it became conditional. Some researchers suggest that this period marks the emergence of more formalized inequality. Status becomes inherited rather than contested purely through violence. Kinship systems grow more complex. Rules governing marriage, descent, and alliance are refined. These developments do not erase the past, they stabilize its outcome. In this sense, the bottleneck functions like a reset, not a cleansing, but a narrowing that sets new boundaries for what follows. The men who survived became foundational. Their descendants populated expanding networks. Their norms shaped emerging traditions. What had once been enforced through threat became encoded in custom. This may help explain why later societies appear both cooperative and hierarchical. Shared rituals bind groups together. Collective labor becomes possible. Yet access to power remains uneven. Lineage still matters. Authority still clusters. Archaeology begins to show clearer signals during this phase. Settlements grow more permanent. Burials become more differentiated. Some individuals are marked with greater care, greater wealth, greater distinction. Inequality leaves material traces now, not because it is new, but because it has stabilized enough to be displayed. Yet even here, the record is selective. The stories preserved are those of continuity, not rupture. Growth, not loss. Expansion, not exclusion. The catastrophe that preceded them is invisible, not because it was small, but because it had already done its work. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if many features of later human society, patrilineal descent, inherited status, control over marriage, are not natural developments, but adaptations to an earlier trauma? What if they are mechanisms designed, consciously or not, to manage the instability created by extreme inequality? In this view, civilization does not emerge in opposition to the silent war. It emerges from it. The rules that once excluded most men are softened but not abandoned. They are reframed as tradition, as morality, as order. The language changes, but the structure persists. Some scholars argue that this continuity can be seen in the persistence of patrilineal systems across much of the world. Even in societies with different subsistence strategies and environments, descent through the male line becomes dominant. This is not universal, but it is widespread enough to raise questions. Why privilege the line that nearly vanished? One explanation is pragmatic. After the bottleneck, male lines are precious. Tracking them becomes important. Preserving them becomes a priority. Over time, this concern hardens into ideology. Fathers matter more than mothers in inheritance, not because women are unimportant, but because male continuity is fragile. If so, then the very emphasis on male lineage in later societies may be a response to its near erasure. This interpretation remains controversial. It cannot be proven directly, but it fits an uncomfortable pattern. Societies often organize themselves around the problems they barely survived. Trauma shapes structure. Loss becomes rule. And if that is true, then the forgotten prehistoric war did not end when male diversity returned. It ended by becoming invisible, by embedding itself so deeply into social organization that it no longer appeared as violence at all. It became normal. To understand whether this legacy truly faded, or whether it continues to influence human behavior, the search must turn to the edges of the record, to the anomalies, the contradictions, and the places where the pattern does not quite hold. Because it is often there, in what does not fit, that buried histories begin to surface again. If the silent war left a legacy, then it is defined as much by absence as by survival. What vanished was not only male lineages, but alternative ways of organizing human life. The genetic bottleneck did more than narrow ancestry. It narrowed possibility. Countless social experiments ended before they could leave descendants to carry them forward. What remains is not a full record of what humanity once was, but a filtered outcome, the result of survival under extreme constraint. This realization complicates how later societies are interpreted. When archaeologists observe the rise of structured kinship systems, inherited status, and controlled marriage networks, these are often framed as natural steps toward complexity. But complexity does not emerge in a vacuum. It grows out of prior conditions. If those conditions were shaped by prolonged exclusion and concentrated power, then later social forms may reflect adaptation rather than innovation. In this sense, the post-bottleneck world is not a fresh beginning. It is a continuation under new terms. Some researchers have suggested that the narrowing of male lines may have reduced social diversity as well as genetic diversity. Fewer lineages mean fewer traditions, fewer competing norms, fewer ways of resolving conflict. Over time, convergence replaces experimentation. Stability increases, but at the cost of variation. This could help explain why certain social patterns become so widespread. Patrilineal descent, male-dominated inheritance, emphasis on legitimacy and control of reproduction. These features appear again and again across unrelated cultures, not because they were inevitable, but because alternatives may have been removed early. Yet this interpretation raises a difficult question. If so much was lost, why does the record feel so complete? Why do later societies appear coherent, functional, even prosperous? Why is there no sense of something missing? The answer may lie in scale. Human experience is local. People live within the systems they inherit. If a society functions, if children are born, food is gathered, meaning is made, then it feels whole, regardless of what preceded it. Loss that occurs over hundreds of generations does not register as loss. It becomes baseline. In this way, the deepest consequences of the silent war are invisible, even to those shaped by them. Genetics allows a glimpse of this hidden history because it does not care about narrative. It records only what persists, and what it records is stark. Modern humanity descends from a remarkably small subset of prehistoric men. The rest, no matter how skilled, how resilient, how numerous, left no trace. This forces a reconsideration of success itself. Survival, in evolutionary terms, is not survival of the best, but survival of the permitted. Traits, behaviors, and ideas do not endure because they are superior, but because they are carried by those allowed to reproduce. When permission is restricted, evolution itself is redirected. If this is true, then the forgotten war did not merely shape who lived, it shaped what kinds of humans could exist. That influence may still be felt. Patterns of dominance, competition, and exclusion recur throughout history. They rise in different forms: empires, castes, classes, but the underlying logic remains familiar. Control reproduction. Control the future. Yet it would be a mistake to see this legacy as destiny. The bottleneck ended. Male diversity returned. Societies changed. Whatever forces once enforced extreme exclusion proved temporary. That fact matters. It suggests that even deeply entrenched systems can break when conditions shift. The buried legacy, then, is not a single lesson, but a tension. Human societies are capable of extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary erasure. They can stabilize through inclusion or through exclusion. The choice between them is not fixed. It is shaped by environment, pressure, and belief. The silent war may be forgotten, but its pattern is not. And to understand whether humanity has truly moved beyond it, the final chapters of this search must confront a harder question, not about the past, but about the present. Because if the forces that once erased 97% of male lineages were human, then they were not extinguished with prehistory. They were merely transformed. If a collapse erased nearly all male lineages, then the most unsettling mystery is not how it happened, but why no one remembered it. Human cultures are built on memory. Even the most ancient societies preserved stories of floods, fires, migrations, and loss. Trauma echoes forward through myth and ritual, reshaped but recognizable. And yet, there is no shared legend of a time when men vanished on a global scale. No warning carried forward. No ancestral grief encoded in story. This absence is not accidental. Memory, like history, is inherited, and inheritance depends on descendants. The men who disappeared genetically left no one to remember them. Their experiences ended with them. Their defeats produced no lineage to pass on cautionary tales. What survived instead were the memories of the few who succeeded, those whose bloodlines continued, whose perspectives became the default record of the past. In this sense, the bottleneck did not merely erase people, it erased viewpoints. Some anthropologists argue that this is how deep structural violence avoids detection. When a system eliminates its critics rather than its supporters, it leaves behind a population that experiences the system as normal. Over time, what was once imposed becomes tradition. What was once exclusion becomes order. Prehistory compounds this effect. Without writing, memory depends on continuity. Stories are passed through families, clans, and lineages. When lineages vanish, so do their stories. A demographic collapse of this magnitude would not produce universal remembrance. It would produce selective amnesia. This reframes the silence as evidence, not absence. The lack of myth may indicate not that nothing traumatic occurred, but that the trauma was asymmetric. Those who suffered did not survive to speak. Those who benefited had no reason to memorialize what secured their dominance. There is also the question of duration. If the collapse unfolded over centuries rather than moments, it would never crystallize into a single story. Each generation would experience only a fragment, slightly fewer men, slightly narrower opportunity. Gradual loss does not inspire legend. It becomes expectation. Some researchers compare this to slow ecological collapse. When change is incremental, people adapt without recognizing the scale of transformation. Only later, when the process is complete, does its magnitude become visible, and by then, the witnesses are gone. Language itself may have played a role. Words for war, massacre, or extermination may not have existed in forms we would recognize. Conflict embedded in kinship rules and marriage restrictions would not be described as violence at all. It would be described as custom, as necessity, as the way things are done. In such a framework, there is nothing to remember because nothing is perceived as extraordinary. This may explain why archaeology and mythology align in their silence. Neither discipline is well suited to capturing normalized exclusion. They detect disruption, not equilibrium. A system that functions smoothly, even if brutally, leaves little narrative residue. And yet, something did survive. Not stories, not monuments, but mathematics. The genetic record does not forget. It does not reinterpret. It does not justify. It simply counts who remained. And what it reveals is a past that human memory could not carry forward. This raises a troubling possibility. If such a profound transformation can vanish from cultural memory entirely, then remembrance is not a safeguard against repetition. A society does not need to remember an atrocity to reproduce its structure. It only needs to preserve the rules that made it possible. The forgotten war, then, may be forgotten precisely because it succeeded. It achieved its outcome so completely that no counter-memory survived. The silence is not a gap. It is a result. And if that is true, then the absence of warning from the past does not mean the danger is past. It means the past has nothing left to say. To understand whether this silence hides more than it reveals, the search must move to the edge of modern inquiry, to the places where researchers hesitate, where evidence exists but interpretation becomes uncomfortable. Because there are questions the past does not answer willingly. If memory failed, then explanation was left to science. And science, too, has been cautious. The genetic bottleneck in male lineages is acknowledged, measured, and debated, but rarely framed in its most extreme terms. Many studies describe it as a demographic imbalance or a reduction in Y chromosome diversity, language that softens implication. The numbers are discussed, but their human meaning is often left unspoken. This restraint is not accidental. To interpret the bottleneck as the result of widespread human-driven exclusion or killing raises uncomfortable questions. It forces modern researchers to confront the possibility that early human societies were capable of sustained, systematic elimination long before states, ideologies, or formal warfare existed. It challenges the assumption that extreme social control requires complexity. Some scholars prefer environmental explanations precisely because they are impersonal. Climate does not choose. Disease does not judge. These forces absolve humanity of intent. Yet, as examined earlier, natural explanations struggle to account for the selectivity of the collapse. Still, hesitation persists. Part of this reluctance comes from methodological limits. Genetics can show outcomes, not motives. It cannot distinguish between coercion and consent, between violence and cultural preference. Any narrative that moves beyond the data risks overreach. Caution, in this sense, is justified. But caution can also become avoidance. There is a deeper reason this question unsettles. If early humans reshaped their own species through exclusion, then modern humans inherit not only the result, but the capacity. The bottleneck becomes more than a prehistoric curiosity. It becomes a mirror. Patterns of control over reproduction did not vanish with prehistory. They reappear in different forms: laws, customs, economic pressures, ideologies. The scale is different, the context has changed, but the underlying logic is familiar. Determine who may continue, and you determine the future. This continuity makes the past difficult to isolate. Some researchers worry that framing the bottleneck as a war risks sensationalism. Others fear it invites political misuse or moral panic. As a result, the discussion remains fragmented, confined to technical journals, stripped of narrative weight. Yet the absence of narrative does not diminish the reality of the pattern. What science hesitates to ask is not whether the collapse happened, but what it reveals about human behavior under pressure. If early societies repeatedly converged on systems that erased most male lineages, then this was not an anomaly of one culture or environment. It was a recurring solution to competition, a solution that worked until it did not. That realization complicates comforting stories of progress. It suggests that cooperation and cruelty evolved together, that stability can be built on exclusion, that survival does not guarantee justice, and that some of the most influential events in human history leave no memory because they eliminate those who would remember. The silence surrounding the bottleneck is not merely academic. It reflects the limits of how far inquiry is willing to go when the answers point back at us. Because once the question is fully asked, it cannot remain safely in the past. If the forgotten prehistoric war reshaped humanity without being remembered, then remembrance is not what prevents repetition. Only awareness does. And awareness, when it challenges deep assumptions about who we are and how we became so, is often the last thing societies are willing to embrace. The silence, then, is not just inherited, it is maintained. To move beyond it, the final chapters of this search must confront the present, not to draw conclusions, but to ask whether the forces that once narrowed humanity's future have truly disappeared, or simply learned new ways to remain unseen. If the forgotten collapse resists memory and unsettles interpretation, then it also exposes the limits of what science can comfortably explain. The genetic bottleneck is measurable. Its statistical signature is real, but beyond the numbers lies a widening circle of uncertainty. Timelines vary by model. Severity depends on assumptions. Even the estimate of 97%, while supported by some reconstructions, remains debated. Evidence indicates an extreme reduction, but how extreme, how fast, and how uniformly it unfolded cannot be fixed with precision. This uncertainty has become a boundary. Within that boundary, researchers are careful. Hypotheses are framed narrowly. Language is controlled. The further interpretation moves from data into behavior, the more tentative it becomes. Not because the questions are unimportant, but because the answers risk exceeding what the evidence can firmly support. Yet limits do not negate implications. What science cannot fully explain is not the existence of the bottleneck, but its mechanism. No single cause fits cleanly. Environmental stress alone is insufficient. Random drift is too weak. Isolated warfare does not scale. Social control explains selectivity, but struggles to account for global convergence without coordination. Each explanation answers part of the puzzle and leaves another part unresolved. This fragmentation has led some researchers to propose that the collapse was not driven by one factor, but by alignment, a convergence of pressures, climatic instability, migration, competition, emerging hierarchy, each reinforcing the others. In such a scenario, no single force is decisive. Together, they create conditions in which extreme reproductive inequality becomes possible, even likely. But this, too, remains speculative. Science can model outcomes. It can test plausibility. What it cannot recover is lived experience. It cannot tell us what it felt like to be a young man without lineage protection, or a woman absorbed into a rival group, or a community enforcing rules it no longer remembers choosing. These human dimensions matter, yet they are inaccessible. This gap between data and experience is where discomfort grows, because filling it requires inference. And inference invites values, assumptions, and modern perspective. Researchers are trained to resist this impulse, to stop where certainty ends. But stopping has a cost. It leaves the most consequential aspects of the collapse unexamined. It allows the event to be treated as an abstraction, a curve on a graph, rather than as a transformation that shaped who could exist at all. Some scholars quietly acknowledge this tension. They admit that the genetic pattern suggests social dynamics far harsher than traditional narratives of prehistory allow. They note that early human groups may have been capable of exclusion on a scale rarely considered. Yet these acknowledgments often remain confined to footnotes and conference discussions. Public narratives stay cautious. This caution preserves credibility. It also preserves silence. What science cannot fully explain, it often leaves unnamed, and what remains unnamed becomes easier to ignore. The bottleneck is discussed, but its human cost remains diffuse, spread across time, stripped of faces, reduced to percentages. Yet even percentages can be unsettling. If modern humanity descends from so few male ancestors, then chance, violence, and rule played a far greater role in shaping us than merit or adaptation alone. The idea of steady progress gives way to something less orderly, a history shaped by narrowing gates and enforced outcomes. Science may never resolve every uncertainty surrounding the forgotten collapse. New data may refine timelines. New methods may adjust estimates. But the central tension is unlikely to disappear. Because at its core, the bottleneck asks a question that evidence alone cannot answer. Not how it happened, but what it means to belong to a species capable of such erasure. And that question does not point backward. It points forward, to how we interpret power, to how we define survival, and to whether we recognize the patterns we inherit before they narrow the future again. If the limits of evidence define what science can say, then the implications define what it struggles to confront. Because the forgotten collapse does not sit comfortably within familiar narratives of human evolution. It suggests that selection was not driven solely by adaptation to environment, but by social filters so severe that they overpowered biology itself. Strength, intelligence, cooperation, none of these guaranteed a future if lineage access was denied. In this light, evolution appears less impartial than often imagined. The bottleneck implies that humanity's genetic future was shaped not just by who survived, but by who was permitted to reproduce. This distinction matters. It shifts emphasis from natural selection to social selection, rules imposed by humans upon humans, with consequences that outlasted the rules themselves. Yet science lacks the tools to measure intent. It cannot determine whether exclusion was conscious or emergent. whether it was justified as protection or accepted as inevitability, whether those enforcing the rules understood their long-term impact. These questions sit at the boundary between data and interpretation, where certainty dissolves. What science can say is that the outcome was extreme. Modern populations show levels of male lineage concentration that are difficult to reconcile with chance alone. The probability of such narrowing without sustained bias is vanishingly small. Something pushed the system repeatedly in the same direction. But was this pressure deliberate? Some researchers argue that framing the collapse in terms of agency risks moralizing the past. Early societies operated under constraints radically different from those of the present. Survival pressures were intense. Choices that appear brutal now may have seemed unavoidable then. To impose modern judgment, they argue, is anachronistic. Others counter that avoiding agency altogether creates its own distortion. It turns human behavior into background noise, as if rules and violence were natural forces rather than decisions embedded in culture. In doing so, it erases responsibility, not of individuals long gone, but of the systems they built. This tension remains unresolved. What science also cannot explain is why this pattern has drawn so little attention outside specialist circles. A demographic event capable of reshaping the entire species should be foundational knowledge. Instead, it remains obscure, rarely discussed beyond genetics and anthropology. Part of this may be due to fragmentation. No single discipline owns the question. Genetics measures the outcome. Archaeology searches for traces. Anthropology proposes mechanisms. Each sees only a fragment. Without synthesis, the whole remains elusive. There is also discomfort in scale. To acknowledge that most men once left no descendants is to accept that human history is built on exclusion more than inclusion. That the past favored consolidation over diversity. That many lives were lived with no path forward, not because of failure, but because of structure. Such ideas resist celebration. They offer no heroes, no triumphs, only survival by narrowing. And yet, the implications persist. If early human societies could repeatedly converge on systems that erased most male lines, then this behavior was not marginal. It was within the range of what humans do under certain conditions. That range has not vanished. It has been constrained, redirected, disguised, but not erased. Science, careful by design, stops short of drawing this line forward. It describes the past. It avoids prescription. But description alone cannot prevent misinterpretation. The forgotten collapse is not a warning encoded in myth. It is a pattern encoded in probability. Whether that pattern remains relevant depends not on evidence, but on recognition. On whether modern societies are willing to see echoes of ancient dynamics in contemporary forms of power, inequality, and control over futures. Science cannot answer whether humanity has learned from what it does not remember. It can only show that forgetting did not prevent it once. And that realization unsettles the boundary between past and present. Because if the forces that narrowed humanity's genetic future were human-made, then the responsibility for recognizing them has always belonged to humans as well. The final question, then, is not whether science will someday explain everything. It is whether explanation alone is enough to ensure that the next narrowing is noticed before it is complete. If the prehistoric collapse of male lineages feels distant, it is only because time has disguised it. The forces that shaped it did not disappear. They changed form. When the genetic bottleneck ended, humanity did not abandon hierarchy, competition, or control over reproduction. It refined them. Violence became regulated. Exclusion became institutional. Permission to belong was no longer enforced solely by kin groups, but by emerging systems of belief, economy, and law. From that point forward, narrowing the future no longer required killing rivals outright. It could be achieved by limiting access to land, to status, to marriage, to resources necessary for family life. The mechanisms became quieter, more abstract, and far more sustainable. In this sense, the Forgotten War did not conclude. It evolved. Researchers who study long-term demographic patterns note a recurring feature of human societies. Reproductive success is rarely evenly distributed. In many historical populations, a small percentage of men father a disproportionate share of children. The scale is smaller than in prehistory, but the direction is familiar. Evidence indicates that as societies grow more complex, inequality does not vanish, it reorganizes. Elites reproduce more successfully. Marginalized groups reproduce less, or not at all. The causes vary: economic pressure, legal restriction, cultural stigma, but the outcome echoes the ancient pattern. This is not to suggest equivalence. Modern societies are not prehistoric clans. The risks, protections, and moral frameworks are fundamentally different, but the underlying principle remains visible. Control the conditions of reproduction, and you shape the future without overt force. What distinguishes the prehistoric bottleneck is not that it was unique, but that it was extreme. It represents a limit case, a moment when narrowing went so far that it reshaped the species itself. Later societies rarely approach that threshold, but they move along the same axis, expanding and contracting inclusion according to circumstance. This continuity unsettles simple narratives of progress. It suggests that the capacity for extreme exclusion is not a flaw corrected by civilization, but a latent option restrained by stability. When systems are stressed by scarcity, fear, or perceived threat, that option becomes visible again. History offers examples. Periods where certain groups are denied the right to marry, to own property, or to pass on identity. Moments when lineage, blood, or legitimacy determine who may exist in the future. These practices do not require violence to be effective. They only require enforcement and time. The prehistoric bottleneck reminds us that time is the most powerful force of all. A rule maintained for a few generations can reshape destiny. A boundary enforced quietly can erase alternatives without spectacle. And once the outcome is achieved, the process fades from memory. This raises a question that history cannot answer for us. If humanity once narrowed itself almost to the point of collapse without realizing it, how would it recognize a similar process today? The ancient collapse left no ruins, no myths, only numbers hidden in blood. Modern forms of narrowing may be equally difficult to see while they are unfolding. They do not announce themselves as catastrophe. They present as policy, tradition, necessity. Like before, they feel normal to those who benefit from them. The Forgotten War, then, is not a story about the past alone. It is a reminder that the most consequential conflicts are not always fought with weapons. They are fought through systems, through decisions about who is allowed to continue and under what conditions. And those decisions rarely feel like war to the ones making them. As the search reaches its end, one truth becomes unavoidable. Humanity has survived extreme narrowing before, but survival did not come with understanding. Whether that understanding is possible now, or whether silence will once again do its work, depends on whether the pattern is seen before it completes itself again. If the Forgotten War never truly ended, then its final legacy is not genetic, it is psychological. The prehistoric collapse teaches us that humanity does not need apocalypse to erase futures. It needs structure. It needs rules that feel reasonable in their own time, It needs enough pressure to make narrowing seem practical, even necessary. And it needs silence, long enough for the outcome to appear natural. This is what makes the event so difficult to confront. There is no villain to condemn, no moment to mourn, no single decision to undo. Only a pattern in which survival is filtered through power, a pattern in which inequality, left unchecked, becomes inheritance, a pattern in which exclusion does not feel like violence until it is complete. The men who vanished in prehistory were not marked as victims. They were simply not remembered. Their absence did not destabilize the world. Humanity continued. In many ways, it flourished. That fact is the most unsettling of all. It suggests that a society can lose almost everything and still believe it has lost nothing. Researchers cannot say whether those ancient people understood what was happening. They may have believed they were preserving order, protecting lineage, ensuring survival in an uncertain world. From within the system, the narrowing may have felt like stability. This is the danger of gradual transformation. When change happens slowly, it is interpreted as normal. When exclusion becomes tradition, it is defended as identity. When power concentrates quietly, it is mistaken for inevitability. By the time the consequences are visible, the path back no longer exists. The genetic bottleneck is proof of that finality. There was no recovery for the lost lines, no restoration of erased possibilities, only replacement. Modern humanity is not diminished in number because of that collapse, but it is shaped by it. Every living man carries a Y chromosome that passed through an impossibly narrow gate. Every living person descends from choices made in a world that no longer exists and never explained itself. This does not mean history is doomed to repeat. The bottleneck ended. The pattern broke. Conditions changed. Humanity adapted. That matters. It shows that even the most entrenched systems can dissolve when they no longer serve survival. But it also shows something else. Change did not come from remembrance. It came from pressure. The silent war ended not because it was recognized as destructive, but because it became inefficient. Because exclusion weakened resilience. Because rigidity failed in a changing world. That distinction matters. If recognition was not required then, it may not be required again. Systems can narrow futures without anyone naming what is being lost, and when the outcome finally appears, it may once again feel like the natural order of things. The prehistoric war that erased most men left no lesson behind, only a trace in DNA, a trace in structure, a trace in the recurring shape of human inequality. Whether that trace becomes a warning depends on the present, on whether societies are willing to examine how power decides who may continue and who quietly disappears from the future. The past offers no judgment. It offers no closure. It only shows what is possible. And in that sense, the most disturbing question is not whether the forgotten war happened. It is whether humanity would recognize it if it were happening again.